I'm going to take a break from covering war topics for a week or two, as I feel they are getting a little bit repetitive. But this one I've come across recently is far too interesting to pass up, and I feel a great one to do before we take a slight break. The life of a man who would find himself travelling from a small Suffolk seaside town to the other side of the world, the deserts of Egypt, the cliffs of Gallipoli, and the western front of the First World War, where he would earn the highest award for bravery the country has to give. Claud Charles Castleton was born here, Morton Road, Kirkley, South Lowestoft, Suffolk, on the 12th of April 1893. He was the second child of Thomas Charles Castleton, a local man from Carlton Colville, and Edith Lucy Castleton, originally from Bishop Stortford in Herefordshire. The couple had married in Christchurch, Lowestoft, on the 12th of September 1887. It looks very likely that it could have been what was known at the time as a marriage of necessity, as his older brother William is also recorded to have been born in 1887. Claud entered education on the 25th of October 1897, aged 4, attending what at the time was Morton Road School, just along from where he lived in Kirkley. The building still exists to this day, but is no longer a school. It is now the Seagull Theatre. He would remain here until the 2nd of August 1905, when he moved on to the Lowestoft Municipal Secondary School. By this time, the Castletons had moved from number 5 to Rose Cottage on Wilson Road in Kirkley. Like most of the time, Claud was a man of faith and would join the Young Man's Christian Association in September 1910. The same year, he would return to Morton Road School, this time as a student teacher, where he would spend 11 months teaching before transferring to London Road School. At some point in his 2 years of teaching, something would come over Claud that there was more to life than blackboards, classrooms, and marking students' work on the quiet Suffolk coast. He left his position in September 1912, aged 19. He packed his bags and boarded a ship bound for the other side of the world, Melbourne, Australia. A decision spurred on by his love of geography and nature, according to his father. With no job awaiting him in Australia, and very few funds to his name, what Claud had planned could be likened to a modern-day gap year. He planned to work his way around the country before returning to Britain, but not before visiting New Zealand, India, and Africa on the way back. But we all know what they say about best laid plans. During his time in Australia, he would turn his hand to sheep farming and even prospecting for gold, all while moving around and seeing the country, spending time in Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, and Tasmania. He would be out of the country itself, in Port Moresby, New Guinea, once again prospecting for gold, when the news reached him that would change his life forever. The tensions that had been growing in Europe over the past few years had exploded into all-out war, with men from all over the world now rallying behind the flags of their respective nations. The men of Australia would be no different. He, along with another man, were originally put in charge of a small armed force of natives set up to defend New Guinea in case of German attack. While there, he would also man the Port Moresby wireless station, but it soon became clear this was not where the war was going to be fought. Claud returned to Australia in 1915 and promptly enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force, the IAF, on the 10th of March in Liverpool, Sydney, part of the now famous Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the ANZACs. After training, he sailed from Sydney on the 25th of June 1915 as 1352 Private Claud Castleton, part of the 18th Battalion. Somewhat ironically, he was bound for a destination that was originally part of his planned route home, Africa, landing in Alexandria in Egypt on the 24th of July, before travelling to Camp Heliopolis, where he waited before the order came to set out as a reinforcement into the rapidly unravelling disaster that was the Gallipoli campaign. British, French, Indian, and ANZAC forces had first landed on the peninsula in Turkey on the 25th of April 1915, in hopes of swiftly moving inland and capturing Constantinople, now Istanbul, and knocking the Ottoman Empire out of the war. For all of their lofty ambitions, talk of overcoming a third-rate army, and overconfidence, so much so that many troops had even been issued occupation money to be used when they took the city. It had now been months, and they had barely made it off the beaches. The summer of 1915 was meant to change this. A huge breakout attack all along the Allied lines to support an amphibious landing was meant to overwhelm the Turkish defences. Claud arrived into this chaos on the 20th of August as part of the 2nd Brigade, and were placed in reserve for the upcoming battle of what was known as Hill 60. The battle began the next day, with Claud, D Company, and the rest of the 18th Battalion being called into action on the 22nd. Due to shortages and supply problems, many men in the 18th were not issued with any bombs for trench clearing, not even the homemade ones that Gallipoli had become famous for. They were forced to purely rely on their rifles and bayonets. The fighting for Hill 60 was to last until the 29th of August, with a final attack made on the 27th. But all would fail to break the Turkish lines and capture the hill. Of the 750 men of the 18th who had started the attack, 380 were killed or wounded. Claud would escape from his first battle unscathed, and would go on to serve on the peninsula for one day under a full month, when he fell victim to one of the most common causes of casualties. Not machine guns, snipers, or artillery shells, but dysentery. After reporting sick, he was taken by hospital ship to Number 4 Auxiliary Hospital in Cairo. Upon recovery, he returned to the 18th, now with the rank of corporal, in December 1915, as the bloody campaign began to wind down. The Gallipoli campaign would end in failure for the invading Allies, suffering over 300,000 casualties, and being forced to evacuate from the little land they had taken in January 1916. Claud returned to Alexandria before moving to a camp at Tel el Kebir, a place made famous in Britain for one of the most celebrated battles of the Victorian era, and due to the actions of a man from Norfolk, something we will cover on a later date. While there, he would fall victim to another of the constant hazards that plague those fighting in the hotter climates of the war, malaria. He would be taken to recover in Number 1 Australian Stationary Hospital from the 27th of January to the 16th of February, before he was returned to active duty. He was transferred from the 18th Battalion to the 5th Australian Machine Gun Company, 5th Brigade, 2nd Australian Division, and was made a temporary sergeant. But he was not to remain in the deserts for long. The British were preparing a large attack on the Western Front to support the French, and once again Claud found himself on board a troop ship, this one bound for Marseille. They would arrive in France on the 23rd of March 1916, and by now his rank of sergeant had been made permanent. But they would not see action on the Western Front until the end of July, when Australian troops were brought in as reinforcements to the Battle of the Somme. Of course, we all know the first day of the Somme, to put it lightly, did not go as planned, and despite successes by individual units and regiments, as well as countless acts of bravery, the day had quickly become a failure. Claud was sent to an area around the village of Pozières on the Somme battlefield. The Germans had been pushed from the ruins of the village on the 23rd, but still held the ridge to the north, meaning they could easily overlook Australian positions and were able to fire right into the trenches, a situation that needed to be rectified as soon as possible. An assault on the German-held ridge was planned for the evening of the 27th of July, but as the men prepared for the attack, they were of course seen by those on the ridge, and soon the German artillery rained down upon them. When the whistle to go was finally blown, those that climbed from their trenches were met by awaiting machine guns, with many killed on the trenches' parapets. Those who were able to advance soon became trapped in no man's land, the machine guns stopping their advance, and the artillery stopping any retreat. All they could do was sit tight and wait for the Germans to stop firing. This wouldn't be until just before dawn on the 28th, when those who could made a break for their own lines, leaving scores of wounded laying out in no man's land, some crawling back, but most hiding in shell holes, desperate for help. Despite how much they wanted to, there was nothing the Australians could do for their wounded comrades. Leaving their positions in daylight would mean certain death for all involved. All they could do was wait until dark before they could offer help. When darkness fell, Sergeant Castleton left his position and climbed from the trench, navigating his way slowly through the maze of barbed wire and carnage to gather up a wounded man. Placing him on his back, he brought him back to the safety of friendly lines. Handing him over, he turned again and went back to fetch more. By now, the Germans had become aware of movement in no man's land, forcing him to often have to take cover from snipers and bursts of machine gun fire. But this didn't stop him finding a second man, who he also brought back to safety, before incredibly turning back again and going for a third. This time, he had pushed his luck too far. He successfully got to a wounded man and had picked him up like the others. But on his return to the trenches, a German got him in his sights and fired. He was hit in the back, killed instantly. He was 23 years old. The Somme would grind on until the 18th of November 1916 and would be a Franco-British victory, but with a huge cost for all factions involved in the battle that had now produced close to 1 million casualties. And especially in Britain, the victories of the latter stages of the battle are still overshadowed by the catastrophe of the first day. Claud Castleton's body was recovered from where he fell and buried to the south of the Albert Bapaume Road near where he was killed. but it was moved after the war to the Pozieres British Cemetery. His actions that night would see him posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest award for bravery in the face of the enemy that was available to British and Empire forces. As with all Victoria Crosses, the announcement of his deed was printed in the London Gazette, being published on the 26th of September 1916. The most conspicuous bravery. During an attack on the enemy's trenches, the infantry was temporarily driven back by intense machine gun fire opened by the enemy. Many wounded were left in no man's land, lying in shell holes. Sergeant Castleton went out twice in the face of intense fire, and each time brought in a wounded man on his back. He went out a third time and was bringing in another wounded man when he himself was hit in the back and killed instantly. He set a splendid example of courage and self-sacrifice. In the absence of a wife, Claud had never married. The medal was presented to his father by King George V at Buckingham Palace on the 29th of November 1916. It was the 738th Victoria Cross to be awarded since its creation in 1856. His medals, the Victoria Cross, the 1914-15 Star, the British War Medal, and the Victory Medal, can be found in the Hall of Valour in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. As said before, his grave can be found in Pozieres British Cemetery on the Somme in France. Plot 4, row L43. The inscription on his grave reads, "Noble life, laid down for freedom, we shall meet our loved one again." As with all posthumous Victoria Cross recipients, his grave is also marked with the carving of the medal. He is also remembered in Australia on the Victoria Cross Memorial in Canberra and the Victoria Cross Memorial in Sydney, as well as Castleton Street in Brisbane, Castleton Street on the White Box Rise Estate in Wandaga, Victoria, and Castleton Crescent in the suburbs of Canberra are all named in his honour. In total, 66 Victoria Crosses were to be awarded to men fighting in the Australian forces in the First World War. In the town of his birth, there is a brass memorial plaque in St Nicholas's Catholic Church in Kirtley, which may seem slightly odd, as on his army records Claud is noted as a Protestant. This is because, at the time, St Nicholas's was Southcliffe Congregational Church. There is a plaque on his former home in Wilson Road. His name can be found on the St Margaret's Parish Church War Memorial. There is a memorial and portrait of him hanging in Lowestoft Town Hall. And much like the Victoria Cross recipients we covered from the city of Norwich, a memorial paving stone was laid in his memory to mark the 100 years since his death, located on Lowestoft's Royal Plain by the War Memorial, as well as Castleton Avenue, Castleton Meadows and Castleton Close, all found in the Lowestoft area being named after him. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. All of the information and pictures used can be found in the description below. Please feel free to like and subscribe if you wish. While we're on the topic, I would once again like to thank everyone who has subscribed so far and have pushed us over the 100 subscriber mark. How nicely this channel is growing is still a bit of a shock to me. This was Claud Charles Castleton, Lowestoft's Victoria Cross hero, and this was a little bit of history.